All right, so Syria, right. I mean, where do you even start with a place like that? It's like layers upon layers of history, empires, cultures, all kind of smashed together.
Yeah, it can be pretty overwhelming
Definitely
if
overwhelming.
you just try to dive in without some kind of roadmap.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're doing today, trying to untangle some of that to make sense of it all. And we're focusing on Syria specifically.
Right, Syria.
And for this deep dive, we're using Wikipedia articles on Syria and the Syrian civil war as our guides.
Good sources, lots of info to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I was reading that even just defining Syria is tricky. Like the area we call Syria today, that's changed a lot over time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, we tend to think of it as this modern nation state with fixed borders, but it's been much more fluid throughout history.
Fluid is a good word. Like
Yeah.
in Roman times, Pliny the Elder, he considered Syria to stretch all the way into parts of what's now Iraq.
Yeah, the Romans, they had a very different concept of what Syria was. It wasn't a unified entity by any means.
Not at all. And they even divided that massive area into different provinces, right?
Oh, yeah, you had Judea, which later became Palestina, and Phoenix, encompassing parts of modern-day Lebanon and Syria. And then there was Hollow Syria.
Hollow Syria. Wait, what? What is that?
It's a direct translation of Coeli Syria,
Yeah.
another Roman division. It's kind of fascinating how even back then Syria was fragmented. That fragmentation, it's a recurring theme throughout its history, really.
Wow, so even back then it was more of a concept than a clearly defined place.
Exactly. You can see how that kind of sets the stage for the complexities we see in Syria today.
So fast forwarding a bit, modern Syria got its independence in the mid-20th century, right smack dab in the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, a time of massive global upheaval. And then in 1956, they signed a pact with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty bold move given the geopolitical climate at the time. Why would they do that?
Well, it brought Syria a lot of support from the Soviets' military aid, economic assistance, but it also ramped up tensions with Turkey, especially over the disputed territory of Skenderun.
Ah, yeah. Escalation. It's always been a bit of a flashpoint, hasn't it?
It has. And that pact with the Soviets, it really poured fuel on the fire. Things got so heated that the UN had to step in to try and mediate the situation.
Wow. So Syria was right in the thick of it, caught between these global superpowers. And then there was that whole United Arab Republic thing with Egypt. Did that really have a chance of working?
It was an ambitious idea. The dream of pan-Arabism, uniting all these different Arab countries under one banner. But it faced a lot of challenges, both internal and external. Ultimately, it didn't last.
Yeah, it seems like those pan-national movements, they rarely work out the way people envision them.
There are just so many factors at play. Cultural differences, economic disparities, political rivalries. It's a tough road to navigate.
Definitely. So we've talked about political tensions, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about oil. You know, you can't discuss the Middle East without talking about oil. Does Syria have its own oil reserves?
Oh, yeah. They struck oil in '56. It was a game changer for them.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of revenue, but also in terms of how they were perceived on the world stage.
Suddenly they were a player.
Exactly. And it also kind of tied their fate to that of other oil-producing countries in the region, especially Iraq. Their oil fields are actually connected in some places.
Whoa, really? So their economies were linked in a way?
In a way, yeah. And it adds another layer of complexity to their relationship, because now those oil fields aren't just about resources, they're strategic assets.
So it's both a blessing and a curse, kind of.
You could say that. It gives them leverage, but it also makes them vulnerable.
Makes sense. So aside from all the politics and the oil, there's also the natural beauty of Syria. You know, I was reading about how diverse its ecosystems are. I always pictured it as mostly desert.
It's easy to have that image, but Syria actually has a surprisingly wide range of environments. Everything from grasslands and forests to coastal regions and mountains.
Wow, that's really changing my perception of the country.
It's a land of contrast for sure. But it's worth noting that despite its biodiversity, Syria ranks pretty low on the Forest Integrity Index.
Huh, that's interesting. I wonder how much of that is due to human activity and how much is just natural.
That's a good question. And I'm sure the conflict hasn't helped matters. But it does make you think about the environmental cost of this war and what it means for Syria's future.
Yeah, it's not just about rebuilding cities and infrastructure. It's about restoring the natural world, too.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
So before we get too deep into the war itself, I was curious about something else. I read that Syria actually implemented some pretty significant agrarian reforms back in the day. Like, they were trying to tackle land ownership inequality.
Yeah, after independence, they really focused on redistributing land and empowering agricultural workers. From 1958 to 61, they saw some of the most dramatic shifts in land ownership in their modern history.
It's not something you hear about every day. It's really interesting to see how they were trying to address those social and economic imbalances.
Gives you a glimpse into what Syria was like before the war and the challenges they were grappling with.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that there was a whole other Syria before the conflict, a Syria with its own unique set of problems and aspirations.
Exactly. It's important to remember that.
And speaking of things that are often overlooked, I was struck by the history of Syria's Jewish community. It's a part of their past that doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's a story that's often overshadowed by the events of the last few decades. This community, they were once a vibrant presence in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Qamishli, but they faced growing challenges in the mid-20th century, which led to a lot of immigration.
It's sad to think about how entire communities can be uprooted like that, especially when you consider the long history of Jewish people in that region.
Yeah, it's a reminder of the human cost of conflict and how it can erase centuries-old ways of life.
Definitely. So I think we've laid some decent groundwork here. But now we have to address the elephant in the room, the Syrian civil war. It's been raging for over a decade, and it's completely reshaped the country. Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
It's a complex conflict with deep roots, but I think a good place to start is with the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. That was really the catalyst for everything that followed.
Right, the Arab Spring. It was this wave of protests and revolutions sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa, demanding democracy and an end to corruption.
Exactly. And in Syria, that discontent was directed at Bashar al-Assad's regime. People wanted reforms, greater freedoms, a more responsive government.
And how did Assad respond to those calls for change?
Not, well, he basically doubled down on repression, cracking down on the protests, which were initially peaceful.
Oh, so it wasn't like an immediate descent into violence.
No, it started with people demanding basic rights and the government responding with force.
And I imagine that only made things worse.
It did. The crackdown fueled the anger and resentment, and armed opposition groups started to emerge, like the Free Syrian Army.
So things escalated pretty quickly.
By mid-2012, what had started as protests had transformed into a full-blown civil war.
Wow. So from peaceful demonstrations to all-out war in just a couple of years. It's hard to believe how fast things spiraled out of control. And it wasn't just a simple two-sided conflict either, right? There were all these different factions involved.
Oh yeah, it was a tangled web. You had Assad clinging to power, you had the rebels trying to overthrow him, you had the Kurds carving out their own autonomous region, and then you had all these extremist groups exploiting the chaos.
It's mind-boggling how many different players were involved. It must have been incredibly difficult to make sense of it all as it was happening.
It was. It was like a giant game of Risk, but with real people's lives at stake.
That's a chilling way to put it. So can you break it down for us? Who are the main factions in this conflict?
Sure. So our sources highlight four main factions. First, you have the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad. They were backed by Russia and Iran. Then you have the Syrian opposition, which was itself divided. You have the Syrian interim government, which was supported by Turkey and some Western powers. And then you have the Syrian Salvation Government, which was a more Islamist coalition.
Wow, so even within the opposition, there were divisions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then you have the Kurdish-dominated Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava. They had their own military wing, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and they received support from the U.S. and other allies. And finally, you have the various jihadist organizations, like the Al-Qaeda branch, Haraz al-Din, and of course the infamous Islamic State, ISIS.
So basically, a whole bunch of groups with different ideologies, goals, and allegiances, all vying for control of the same piece of land.
Exactly. It was a recipe for chaos.
Yeah.
And then to make matters worse, you had all this foreign involvement, different countries backing different factions, turning Syria into a proxy war.
Yeah, that always makes things more complicated. So who are the main foreign powers in it?
Yeah, we already mentioned Russia and Iran supporting Assad and Turkey, and some Western powers backing the Syrian government. But there were others too.
And Hezbollah was involved too, right?
Yes, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group, they were actively supporting the Syrian government, which obviously raised some eyebrows.
Especially with Israel.
Oh yeah, Hezbollah's involvement drew repeated Israeli airstrikes into Syria, adding another layer of complexity and risk to an already volatile situation.
It's incredible how quickly things can escalate in that region. One wrong move, and it could trigger a much wider conflict.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the Syrian civil war so important to understand. Yeah. It's not just a local conflict. It has implications for the entire region and beyond.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how interconnected the world is and how one country's problems can quickly spill over into others. We saw that with ISIL's incursion into Iraq in 2014, right?
Yeah, ISIL, They seized control of vast swaths of territory in both Syria and Iraq, exploiting the power vacuum created by the civil war.
Right.
And we also saw sectarian violence erupt in Lebanon, fueled by the conflict in Syria, so the effects were definitely felt far and wide.
Okay, so this is already pretty heavy stuff, but I think we need to talk about the weapons that were used in this war, just to kind of drive home the point about the level of destruction we're talking about.
Yeah, the Syrian civil war saw the use of some truly devastating weaponry. For instance, the Syrian government with Russian support used thermobaric weapons, also known as fuel air bombs. These things are terrifying. They basically unleash massive explosions that are especially deadly in urban areas.
Yeah, I remember reading about those. They're the ones that suck all the oxygen out of the air, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're incredibly destructive, and their indiscriminate nature raises serious ethical concerns.
And then you had all those anti-tank missiles being supplied to the rebels, right?
Yeah, the BGM-71 TOW missiles,
Yeah.
primarily supplied by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. They proved to be very effective against armored vehicles, but they also highlighted the influx of advanced weaponry into the conflict.
It's like a never-ending arms race. Each side trying to outdo the other with more and more powerful weapons.
And of course, Iran got involved too. Remember when they fired those Zulfikar ballistic missiles at ISIL targets back in 2017?
Yeah, that was a pretty big deal. It showed that they were willing to project their power beyond their own borders. So we've got all these different factions. Foreign powers, advanced weaponry. It's a recipe for disaster.
And unfortunately, the Syrian people were caught in the middle of it all.
And I think it's also important to talk about the sectarian dimension of this conflict. You know, the Alawites, the minority group to which Bashar al-Assad belongs, they were particularly vulnerable during the war.
Yeah, the sectarian element added another layer of complexity and tragedy to the conflict. Some opposition elements called for the persecution of Alawites, and Alawite men suffered disproportionately high casualties while fighting for the government.
It's heartbreaking to think about an entire group being targeted just because of their religious beliefs.
It highlights the dangers of sectarianism and the need for inclusive solutions that address the root causes of these divisions.
Yeah, we can't just ignore these deep-seated resentments. We have to find a way to bridge those divides.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that Christians were also targeted by anti-government rebels during the war. So it wasn't just about Sunni versus Shia. There were multiple layers of sectarian violence.
It's a reminder of how quickly things can devolve when people are driven by fear and hatred.
And how important it is to promote tolerance and understanding.
So we've talked about the factions, the foreign involvement, the sectarian violence, but we can't forget about the millions of Syrians who were forced to flee their homes during the war. It was a massive refugee crisis.
Yeah, the human displacement caused by this war is truly staggering. Millions of people were internally displaced within Syria itself, and millions more fled to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan.
It put an enormous strain on those countries' resources and infrastructure.
It did. And while some European countries like Germany accepted a significant number of refugees, you have to wonder if the international community could have done more.
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines, but finding a solution that works for everyone is much harder.
And we can't forget about the conditions in those refugee camps, especially during the harsh winter months. It was a desperate situation for many people.
It's heartbreaking to think about all those families forced to leave everything behind and to live in these makeshift camps with very little support.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of war.
Definitely. And amidst all the chaos and displacement, we can't lose sight of the fact that this war claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The death toll is absolutely staggering.
It is. And beyond the sheer numbers, there are countless stories of individual loss and suffering. Families torn apart, communities, shattered lives cut short.
And I read that there were widespread human rights violations committed by all sides during the conflict. Things like forced disappearances, torture, the use of siege tactics, and starvation.
Yeah, it's a grim reality of war, that even in the 21st century, we still see these kinds of atrocities being committed.
It's a reminder of the dark side of human nature and the fragility of civilization.
We like to think that we've evolved beyond such barbarity, but the Syrian civil war shows that we still have a long way to go.
So, given all of this, what was the international community's response to the conflict? I mean, aside from taking in some refugees, did they try to do anything to stop the fighting?
Well, there were a lot of condemnations of the violence. Many countries, including the Arab League, the European Union, the UN, and Western governments, they all spoke out against the Syrian government's actions.
So there was a sense of outrage.
There was. But translating that outrage into concrete action proved to be much more difficult.
So it wasn't as simple as everyone uniting against Assad.
No. The situation was much more complex than that. Some Middle Eastern governments initially backed Assad, but then they kind of shifted to a more balanced approach, criticizing actions on both sides.
It's like they were trying to play both sides, hoping to come out on top no matter who won.
It's a cynical way to look at it,
Yeah.
but there's definitely some truth to that. And then you had Russia and China consistently blocking UN Security Council resolutions that would have imposed sanctions on the Syrian government.
So they were basically protecting Assad.
You could say that. They had their own interests in the region, and they weren't willing to let the West dictate the terms of engagement.
It sounds like a real diplomatic mess.
It was, and it made it very difficult to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. Everyone had their own agenda and their own red lines.
So were there any attempts at all to broker peace?
There were. One of the most prominent efforts were the UN-mediated Geneva peace talks. They had multiple rounds of negotiations trying to find some kind of common ground.
But it didn't work.
No. Ultimately, they failed to reach a lasting peace agreement. The conflict was just too complex, too many factions, too much foreign involvement, too much mistrust.
It sounds like a classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the Syrian people paid the price for that failure.
So before the Assad regime fell, things were incredibly complex. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive so far, from the geographical and historical context to the humanitarian crisis and the international community's response. It's a lot to process.
It is. And it's important to remember that this is just a snapshot of a very complex and ever-changing situation. The Syrian civil war is still unfolding, and the situation on the ground is constantly evolving.
That's a great point. So before we move on to what happened after the fall of the Assad regime, I want to pause here and just let all of that sink in. We've learned about the history of Syria, the causes of the war, the different factions involved, the foreign interventions, the humanitarian crisis. It's a lot to take in, but it's all essential to understanding what's happening in Syria today and what might happen in the future.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, seeing how all these different pieces fit together, and understanding the forces that have shaped this conflict.
So I want to hear from you, the listener. What stood out to you most in this deep dive so far? What new insights have you gained about Syria? Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned and consider the broader implications of this conflict. What does it tell us about the world we live in, about the challenges we face in the 21st century?
It's a question worth pondering. As the Syrian civil war continues to cast a long shadow over the Middle East and beyond.
We'll be back in a few minutes to continue our deep dive and to explore what happened after the fall of the Assad regime, so stay tuned.
It really is a turning point, a new chapter for Syria. But it's hard to say what that chapter will hold.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a crossroads. So many different paths Syria could take from here.
Exactly. And so many factors at play. Internal dynamics, external pressures, the lingering effects of the war. It's a complex equation.
Definitely. So with the Assad regime gone, who steps into that power vacuum, is it the Syrian opposition, the Kurdish-led forces, or maybe someone we haven't even considered yet?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And how do the big players react? Russia, Iran, Turkey, the U.S.
Yeah.
Do they try to influence events, prop up their preferred factions?
Yeah.
It could easily lead to more instability.
It's like a giant geopolitical chessboard, everyone maneuvering for position. But in the midst of all that, it's easy to forget about the Syrian people themselves.
Ones who've been through hell and back.
Yeah, exactly. They've endured over a decade of war. What happens to them now?
Well, on a human level, the trauma is immense. The psychological scars, the loss, the displacement, it's going to take generations to heal.
It's hard to even imagine what they've been through. And now they've faced the monumental task of rebuilding their lives, their communities, their entire country.
It's a daunting prospect, not just physically, but emotionally and socially too. The fabric of Syrian society has been torn apart.
So where do they even begin?
Well, for starters, they need a massive amount of support from the international community, from humanitarian organizations, from anyone who can help.
So aid is crucial, but what kind of aid? What do they need most?
It's multifaceted. They need help rebuilding infrastructure, homes, schools, hospitals, roads. They need access to basic services, clean water, sanitation, healthcare. And they need economic opportunities, ways to rebuild their livelihoods.
It sounds like a massive undertaking, and with so many different players involved, how do we ensure that aid actually reaches the people who need it most?
That's a challenge, for sure. There's always the risk of corruption, of aid being diverted or misused.
Yeah.
And there's the question of who controls the distribution of aid.
Right, because if it's controlled by one faction or another, It could be used as a tool to exert power or influence.
Exactly. So transparency, accountability, and local ownership are key. The Syrian people need to be empowered to make decisions about their own future.
So it's not just about giving them money or supplies, it's about supporting their agency, their ability to shape their own destiny.
Right. It's about listening to their needs, respecting their perspectives, and working with them as partners, not just beneficiaries.
And recognizing their resilience, their strength to the face of adversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Syrian people have endured unimaginable hardship, and they deserve a chance to rebuild their lives in a way that reflects their values and aspirations.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. The fall of the Assad regime is a significant event, but the path forward is far from clear.
It's a moment of great potential, but also great risk.
And ultimately, it's up to the Syrian people to decide what that future will look like.
They're the ones who will write the next chapter of their story.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to turn it over to you, the listener. We've explored the history, the conflict, the factions, the international involvement. Now, with the Assad regime gone, what do you think the future holds for Syria? What paths might lead to a more peaceful and just future for this war-torn nation?
It's a question worth pondering as we try to make sense of this complex and ever-changing situation.
It's a lot to think about, right? Like, we've covered so much ground, but I still feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're trying to assemble this puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape.
Exactly. It makes it hard to see the full picture.
And I think that's important to acknowledge. We can't pretend to have all the answers. This conflict, it's rooted in such a long and complex history.
Yeah, layers upon layers of social dynamics, geopolitical factors, religious tensions. It's easy to oversimplify things, to try and fit it all into a neat little box.
But that's not how the world works, especially not in a place like Syria.
So how do we avoid those oversimplifications? How do we approach this topic with the nuance it deserves?
Well, I think it starts with humility. Recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and that our own perspectives are limited.
So being open to different viewpoints, challenging our own assumptions.
Exactly. And listening to the voices of the Syrian people themselves, the ones who've lived through this conflict firsthand.
Because ultimately, their perspectives are the ones that matter most.
Absolutely. It's their country, their future.
This deep dive has definitely made me realize how much I don't know about Syria and how important it is to keep learning, to keep engaging with different perspectives.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And I think it's also important to remember that the Syrian civil war is not an isolated event. It's part of a much larger global context.
Oh yeah, for sure. You see a lot of the same trends playing out in other parts of the world. The rise of sectarianism and extremism, the erosion of democratic norms, the growing influence of foreign powers and regional conflicts.
It's a sobering reminder that we live in an interconnected world, and that what happens in one corner of the globe can have ripple effects everywhere else.
Absolutely.
Right.
So we can't afford to be complacent. We have to be engaged citizens, informed advocates, active participants in shaping the world we want to see.
Because the Syrian civil war is a wake-up call. It's a reminder of what can happen when we turn a blind eye to injustice, when we fail to stand up for human rights.
It's all to action, to work towards a more just and equitable world.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive into Syria, I want to leave you with this thought. We've learned a lot about the history of this conflict, the human cost, the challenges that lie ahead, but we've also seen the resilience of the Syrian people, their determination to rebuild their lives.
And their hope for a brighter future.
So let's not give up on that hope. Let's continue to learn to engage, to advocate, and to work towards a world where peace and justice prevail. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and may we all continue to strive for a better tomorrow.